Welcome back, Defenders. Jake here. In today's video, we're going to talk about a bank run that happened here in the United States and how this relates to Russia and Ukraine. So Silicon Valley Bank is shut down by regulators in the biggest bank failure since the global financial crisis 15 years ago. And this was a pretty large bank here in the United States. It was ranked 18th by assets under management, $212 billion. This was a publicly traded company with a market cap of $26 billion. So before you panic about your money in your bank, I don't think this is going to spread, and I'll explain to you why in this video. But basically, Silicon Valley Bank was a regional bank that tailored to a very specific clientele, mostly tech companies and startups in Silicon Valley. So to explain to you exactly what happened, I have to first make sure you understand how the fractional reserve banking system works. And I can explain it to you like this. Let's pretend Squidward receives an inheritance of $100,000, and he chose to deposit that money into Silicon Valley Bank. Now, all banks do this. They take customer deposits and then they loan that money out to other people with interest to make a profit. These are personal loans, small business loans, car loans, whatever. But there is a legal requirement that the bank keep a certain percentage of the initial deposit in reserves in the event that Squidward wants to take a little bit of his money out. So let's say initially Squidward put $100,000 in the bank. The bank held in reserves 10% or $10,000. It then loaned out $90,000 in a small business loan to SpongeBob. So what do you think SpongeBob is going to do with that money? More than likely, he's just going to deposit it right back into his Silicon Valley Bank account. Now the bank can repeat this process. It has to hold 10% of this money in reserve, $9,000. It can then loan the money out to somebody else, for example, Patrick, and they can loan out $81,000, keeping $8,100 of it in reserve at the bank. So this fractional reserve banking system works great if all of the customers are confident that they can get their money out when they want to. But if all the customers want to get their money out at the same time, this is impossible. This is what a bank run is. So think about it. On paper, Squidward thinks he has $100,000 in the bank. SpongeBob thinks he has $90,000. Patrick thinks he has $81,000. But the bank only has $27,000 that can cover customer withdrawals should everyone want to withdraw their money at the same time. Now, why do we have the fractional reserve banking system? And it increases the money supply. This is called the velocity of money, and generally this is a good thing. This is how you grow your economy even faster. The initial $100,000 from Squidward has generated $270,000 worth of economic activity. This is a good thing normally for a growing economy. But when things start to contract, it gets a little frightening at sometimes, and this is what happened to Silicon Valley Bank. And to explain why Silicon Valley Bank is kind of an anomaly, let's go back to the February 2020 COVID stock market crash. When the pandemic initially hit and everything shut down, everybody was panicking. The stock market here in the United States dropped by 31%. It was at this point that governments around the world started printing stimulus checks, Fed rates went to zero, loans were guaranteed, money was just being piled up everywhere. This caused asset prices to inflate. Now, eventually the world economy did recover. It's been overheating the last year in 2020. But for Silicon Valley especially, these were good times. Money was flush. Investors had money they wanted to dump into risky startups and tech companies that don't make a profit. So let me illustrate this by showing you Silicon Valley's total group assets. So this is how much money they had with the bank. And for most of the 2010s, they were experiencing healthy, normal growth for a regional bank. But as soon as we get to the COVID crash, the first quarter of 2020, look at their assets under management. It just exploded. So this chart shows you the quarterly values. This chart shows you the year-over-year quarterly growth. So for the third quarter of 2021, their assets on the books doubled. It went up by 97% year over year. This is not normal for other banks. Let me show you a comparison. Here's Bank of America. We can look at their quarterly values. And yes, it did shoot up in response to government stimulus and 0% interest rates and the money supply expanding. But their largest quarter year over year was only an expansion of 15%. It didn't double like Silicon Valley Bank did. So what happened with Silicon Valley Bank is they were getting all of these customer deposits. All this money was coming in, and they were trying to do the responsible thing. They were trying to say, where can we stick all of this customer money to protect the customers and protect the bank? So what they did is they started buying US Treasuries. Normally, this is a risk-free return as long as the United States government doesn't collapse. But what Silicon Valley Bank did is they were buying longer maturity bonds, 2 years, 5 years, and 10 years. So on Silicon Valley's, the bank's books, they had all these government bonds with yields of 2%, 3%, 1.5%. Maybe they were even dumb enough to be buying down here when they were only getting 0.14% on, for example, a 2-year yield. Now, as the Fed has been tightening monetary policy, what's happened is not as much money is coming into the bank. In fact, money is starting to flow in the opposite direction. So it peaked in the first quarter of 2022, and assets under management at the bank has actually been dropping as the Fed is tightening. So what Silicon Valley Bank had to do is they had to sell their bonds on the open market to cover customer deposits being taken out of the bank. The problem is that US Treasury yields have been going up. They're now at 4% or 5%. So if you're Silicon Valley Bank, how do you sell a bond that only yields 2% when any investor can go to the Fed today and get a bond that yields close to 5%? The answer is you have to sell that bond for a loss. If you just hold the bond until it matures, you don't lose anything, but if you're desperate, like Silicon Valley Bank, you just have to dump the bonds for whatever price you can get from another bonds trader. So they were taking massive losses, hundreds of millions of dollars in losses, dumping their government securities because the yields have gone up so sharply the last year. And this is what did in the bank. Silicon Valley Bank CEO to investors, stay calm and don't panic. This is the wrong language. For people at a bank telling your institutional clients, stay calm and don't panic. I mean, what does human nature do? People panic. It also really doesn't help that the president and CEO of Silicon Valley Bank, Gregory Becker, sold $5 million worth of shares just 2 weeks ago. In my opinion, I think this is a crime. This is insider trading. He knew that the bank was experiencing liquidity problems and were dumping their government bonds for huge losses. Yet less than 2 weeks ago, this guy sold $5 million worth of stock. Here is the current share price of Silicon Valley Bank. Today is Sunday. I think when the markets open on Monday, this is going to zero. All investor equity in Silicon Valley Bank is going to be wiped out. This company is bankrupt. It doesn't exist anymore. But the share price of this company was almost $600 just a year ago. This week it was in the 200s, but Now it's at 100, and like I said, it's going to zero. So how does this relate to Russia and Ukraine? And we have to ask ourselves the question, what is Federal Reserve Chairman Jerome Powell currently thinking? The joke here in America is that the Federal Reserve Chairman is the most powerful man in America, more powerful than the President of the United States. And according to the Fed's mandate in their charter, it's two parts. The first part is price stability. They want year-over-year inflation to be between 0 and 2%. The other part is full employment. They want the unemployment rate in America to be as low as possible. So it's not part of the Fed's mandate to concern themselves with foreign policy, with the fact that the largest land war in Europe since World War II is currently going on. It's not the Fed's place to be talking about such a thing, but to realistically believe that he doesn't pay attention to the news and he doesn't care about the outcome of the war in Ukraine, I don't believe it. I do believe that the war is part of what is driving his decision-making process, but he's never going to publicly talk about it. Publicly, he's only going to talk about the current inflation rates. So here is the monthly inflation rate here in the United States. If we go back to 2020 and 2021, it wasn't really a problem. But inflation got really bad and peaked last summer, 4 months after Russia invaded Ukraine. And the inflation rate peaked in June at 9.1%. It was at this point that the Fed started raising interest rates and tapering. This is quantitative tightening. And the year-over-year inflation rate has been coming down. Now, I don't think the Fed is going to stop tightening until this is at least under 3%. The goal is between 0 and 2, but if it gets under 3, I think the Fed will call that a win. The other metric that the Fed cares about is the unemployment rate in the United States. So if we go back to the great financial crisis of 2008-2009, unemployment here in the United States hit 10%, and interest rates were at near zero for almost a decade. And over this decade, the unemployment rate just kept going down. We then had the COVID crash with everyone being laid off and lots of uncertainty. But in the last 2 years, we've completely recovered. And in January, the unemployment rate was 3.4%, which was the lowest rate in like 50 years. So as long as the unemployment rate is below 5%, I don't think the Fed is going to be concerned about rising unemployment. In some ways, they want this in order to cool off wage inflation. So everyone who wants to find a job here in the United States can still find a job, and that's likely to be true as long as this is, for sure, under 4%. So here is the federal funds effective rate, and when the Fed raises this, it makes it more difficult and more expensive to borrow money. Currently, it's at 4.5%. The Fed is meeting this week. They're probably going to raise it another 25 basis points and get this up to 4.75. Now, going back to Silicon Valley Bank, I don't want to seem indifferent to people losing their money, but for individuals, they're all FDIC insured up to $250,000. So for any individuals and families that had deposits in this bank, they're going to have access to their money on Monday up to the $250,000 insured limit. So who loses their money when a bank fails? And it's anybody above that $250,000 limit, but specifically businesses. And Silicon Valley Bank spent decades marketing themselves as the bank for tech companies and startups in Silicon Valley. So investors are imploring the government to step in and help these companies that might be losing millions of dollars. Here's a current list of companies that have declared how much they had in deposits at Silicon Valley Bank. For example, Roku, $487 million, BlockFi, Roblox, Rocket Lab. So yeah, anything over $250,000, they're not insured. They can lose this money. You can lose your money holding it in a bank. And it is pretty fascinating when you go on Twitter seeing all these libertarian venture capitalists screaming that the government needs to step in and protect the deposits of these companies. So here's David Sachs. And anytime we talk about government spending or tax dollars, they're just going to draw the analogy about what about Ukraine? So David Sachs says that Treasury Secretary Yellen was in Kyiv last week to reassure Ukraine that U.S. financial aid would continue, but she can't reassure the 10,000 plus small businesses that their deposits are safe. She says she's monitoring the situation. Give me a break. Another tweet down here. There's no contradiction unless you believe in protecting Ukraine, but not the U.S. economy. Here's another tweet from super investor Bill Ackman. Bill Ackman actually is very supportive of Ukraine. I really like this guy, but he also makes the comparison with the war currently between Russia and Ukraine. If Russia wanted to destroy or materially impair 65,000 of our most promising new technology and biotech companies, there is no method better than a cyber attack that blows up Silicon Valley Bank with the government not guaranteeing their deposits. The irony is that we did it to ourselves. I just don't buy this argument. It's these super investors and venture capitalists. They're the ones losing money by all of these deposits vanishing. Yes, that's unfortunate that, these startups, these tech companies, they're going to lose millions potentially. SVB will be liquidated, and I do think most of these people will get 30 to 50% of their deposits back in time, but in the short term, they're in trouble. But here's the truth. This is just my personal opinion about startups in Silicon Valley. 90% of them fail anyways. 90% of them run out of money and go bankrupt regardless. So it's a very high risk, high reward industry. Most people with a good idea, it's not that hard, or it hasn't been that hard the last decade to get funding. And then they never figure out a way to build to scale so that they can become profitable. Does this, in the end, hurt the American economy? And I'm going to argue no, because these people are still intelligent, they're still hardworking. If their startup fails, they can go get a job with any other company. If they have a valuable product, service, idea, or any kind of intellectual property, they can merge with another company or sell their idea to somebody else. Ideas don't die when startups that can't ever make profitability fail. But here's the honest truth. This is from Bank of America. Fed tightening cycles always break something. So anytime the United States Federal Reserve raises interest rates, they do it until there's some kind of crisis and something breaks. And what this means is that the companies least prepared, they have the worst financials, least prepared to survive a contraction or a slowdown in the global economy, those businesses will fail. People will lose their jobs. People will lose money. It's inevitable. That's capitalism. But the same is true for governments. Governments least prepared to handle a global financial crisis, a contraction in the monetary supply, they're going to fail as well. And that's ultimately the goal. That's what I've been arguing on my channel is the plan from the West. All Western central banks are tightening monetary policy to apply the maximum amount of pressure on countries least prepared to deal with a global slowdown, with Russia making the top of that list. Does a record budget deficit herald the collapse of the Russian economy? So this is a recent article from February. January's figures for Russia's budget spending look so alarming that they have prompted talk of the impending collapse of the economy. The first month of 2023 saw the deficit reach a record 1.8 trillion rubles, Spending grew by 58% compared to January of last year, when there was a budget surplus of 125 billion rubles. This is equivalent to $25 billion. So in January, Russia ran a 1.8 trillion ruble monthly budget deficit fighting this war, whereas a year ago they had a surplus. They had a surplus of 125 billion rubles. Russia does not have access to the international bond markets. Nobody is going to loan Russia money. Russia has only been able to survive this last year by spending their reserves. Putin had amassed this war chest of over $600 billion. $300 billion was frozen in foreign banks, which is hilarious, but he still had $300 billion to get him through 2022. That money is going to run out this year, and Russia has no fix. They have no solution, and a crisis is coming. So let's check in on the front lines, and the city of Bakhmut continues to hold. This is really pathetic for the Russians. And potentially one of the explanations for why Ukraine can continue to hold on to this city is the Wagner Group may take a tactical pause in their Bakhmut offensive. Russia's controversial Wagner Group could take on a reduced role in the next phase of fighting for the city it's being claimed. And there's a couple reasons why. The first one is that the regular Russian military is dealing with shortages and they want to keep resources and ammunition for themselves. The other one is that Prigozhin of the Wagner Group was cut off from recruiting in prisons 2 months ago. So they're running out of people. They're running out of these, they call them meat, for these meat wave attacks. So Russia's Wagner Group is opening dozens of recruitment centers across Russia to get people to join the Wagner Group. We'll see if it works. He was able to get prisoners pretty easily, lying to them about getting their sentences commuted after 6 months, but for a free man, trying to work out at the gym, I don't think the recruitment posters are going to work. And Prigozhin has a problem in that every other oligarch in Russia currently is trying to form their own private military group and recruit. So reports in Russian social media appear that companies like Gazprom and Rosneft and others are starting their own private military companies. The reason why is these oligarchs want men loyal to them to fight and defend them should greater chaos, uncertainty, or anarchy fall upon Russia. So we're entering this crisis period where I argue within the next couple of years it's inevitable that the Russian Federation will collapse and be broken up into smaller states. It's up to Russia how violent they want this transition of decolonization to be. But in the meantime, if you're a billionaire in Russia, you're not taking any chances. You're recruiting young men now and buying weapons for them now so that you can protect what's yours when the central government in Moscow can't maintain order and stability anymore. So this debate on social media rages all the time. Who does time favor? Whose side is time on? Ukraine or the Russians? And let's go ahead and listen to the Russians. Here on Kremlin State TV, they're claiming time is on Ukraine's side.
Сейчас время скорее на кого играет, на украинцев или на нас?
Время сейчас, мне кажется, что все-таки с поставками с передачей каждой партии западного вооружения, вооруженные силы Украины все более и более приобретают новые и наступательные возможности, и новые, и оперативные, и боевые. Поэтому время сейчас вроде как в их пользу. Нам же надо завершать этот конфликт, опять-таки, на мой взгляд, по моим предположениям, но все-таки в максимально короткие сроки.
This is one time on Kremlin State TV that I'm actually going to believe what the Russians are saying. Here's some good news from Ukraine. The first of around 100 Leopard 1 tanks promised from Denmark, Germany, and the Netherlands will arrive early in May. Pakistan has also offered to give 44 T-80UD tanks to Ukraine in exchange for Western financial support, so thank you so much, Pakistan. More bad news for Russia as Hungary prepares to reconsider relations with Russia because of geopolitical realities. The war in Ukraine, which has been going on for more than a year, has deprived Russia of its last allies in Europe. Hungarian Prime Minister Viktor Orban said that the country would have to reconsider relations with Moscow because of the changing geopolitical realities. So Putin's master plan, his grand strategy, was for Western governments to have elections and then pro-Ukrainian candidates collapse. They fail in those elections as Europeans tire of supporting Ukraine. But what actually is happening is the opposite. Countries that were friendly to Russia, such as Serbia and Hungary, all they want to do now is get along with their neighboring countries, and they're giving up on trying to defend or publicly support Russia. All right, let's hit you with one final feel-good clip. Yesterday was the day of the national anthem in Ukraine, and here is a nice compilation video I found of Ukrainian defenders singing their national anthem.
Гинуть наші вороженьки, як роса на сонці, запанує місяця у своїй сторонці.
That's all for this update video. Glory to Ukraine, glory to the heroes. If you found this video informative, give me a thumbs up. Best way to support the channel. Comments and questions, let me know down below. I love hearing from you guys. Till the next video, keep defending the truth, keep defending democracy.